thing for as long as I've lived here that like no one is picking it up. It's like that. I felt like, as far as making a kind of a greater political statement about this town, or I mean, about like the world through this town, that, I felt like living in Santa Fe under sort of corporate political leadership meant it's on you to pick up the trash. It's like, it's on you to ensure that there aren't goat head burrs in the parks. It's like everything, like no one is, the leadership is asleep at the wheel. And so like, it really felt like living in a failed state. Like I can only imagine what working for the city has felt like, where it's like, if you want to get something done, you have to work around these people. And so I'm hopeful for us, and I'm hopeful for, I don't know. I think one of the qualities of our conversation is probably going to be like, the sort of, it's always darkest before the dawn, and that like what we are seeing now is not a sort of linear, if trends continue situation. It's like, it gets to a place where something must be done. And so something happens, and so I don't know, it's weird. It's like the messier and more chaotic and spooky the world gets, the more convinced I am that, we're going to have this starting to sort itself out in the next few years, whatever that looks like. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate that perspective. And I think you're definitely right in the sense that it has to happen, not in any like sort of moral declaration sense of the word, but it's like the entropy is such that just the basic thermodynamics of the thing, like
that's exactly it. And for people who are used to hearing you talk about this stuff and not used to hearing me talk about this stuff, I look at it through the major evolutionary transitions. And so you have this sort of general pattern that happens you see the same thing at like the origin of complex cells, which are kind of the response to a crisis, that, like a bacteria is getting so big that its genetic copying starts to fail, and it can't actually transport resources within the cell very effectively. And so like there's an upper threshold to the size of a bacterium that is solved by introducing all of this new regulatory apparatus at the level of like chromosomal organization and, the endoplasmic reticulum and all this stuff, the organelles inside of cells. And then something similar happens with the origin of syntactic language, which is where I got myself really keenly interested in this about 20 years ago, was that there was, Martin Nowak and his co-authors at Princeton at the time had written this paper on the origin of syntactic language that said like the sentence emerged in a very similar way, where it's like your population scales linearly with, more, as you add one more person, then the number of relationships in that population is scaling super linearly. And so the number of things that are worth talking about in order to keep us a proto-human society coherent is exponential as it gets bigger. And at some point you have to remember so many words, or you have to like try and like stick familiar words together in a way that makes sense, that you get like similar kind of copying errors in communication. That's what they called the error catastrophe. And of course, like right at the cusp of language itself, I'm sure, our distant ancestors were like, we are so fucked. Like, how are we, like, we have all of these things we can't even talk about. Like, we don't know how to communicate the stuff that is really, really vital and important. And then you get this, this new structure in language that allows us to be like, okay, these are nouns and these are verbs, and like they fit together like this. And that's everywhere in complex systems. Like there's always this, I mean, and it's not a guarantee, right? Like the affordances have to be there for that new structure to develop. And I think that when people are asking about, are we going to make it right now as a species? What they're really asking is like, are the pieces lying around for us to create the new syntax that we need in order to make sense of, how we coordinate at scale, etc.
Boom. What an opening salvo. Segues perfectly. So let's take it from there. So first of all, I'm joined today by Michael Garfield. This conversation has been a long time in the works. So thanks for taking the time to chat.
Yeah, totally. Agreed.
When I first discovered your work, it was called Future Fossils. Now it's called Humans on the Loop. And what we're going to be talking about pierces that exact phrase. So maybe as a starting point for folks who maybe aren't familiar, if you could talk about not only what your work with Humans on the Loop is, but what you're specifically trying to do with that phrase relative to the one that it's building off of that you have a lot of gripes with.
Yeah. I can point people to a post I just made about this. And that phrase, yeah, like people are always like, oh, yeah, humans in the loop. It's like, no, 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 no. There was a 3-part taxonomy that Bonnie Doherty presented to the UN Civil Rights Watch in 2012 about automated weapons. And so, like, 2 of those 3 terms are very well known. There's, the in the loop and out of the loop. The idea that, like, you are the one that is ultimately making a decision about the firing of an automated weapon, or you're not. The weapon is doing it on its own. But then there's this third zone, and I think that the third zone is the zone where, like, all decision making is really happening. Like these other 2, to be truly and absolutely in or out of the loop suggests a couple things. It suggests that there's one loop. It suggests that there's one decision. And that's just not our world, so on the loop is where the automated system is making a decision and the human operator is deciding whether to approve or veto that decision. And, I think about this in terms of, like our own physiology and like the way that, the thoughts that you have are basically the result of a kind of, evolutionary contest between different autonomous processes going on in your own body. Like it's up to you to decide, like I'm feeling this. And of course I've got kids. I've got a 6-year-old girl and a 4-year-old boy. And so this is the kind of thing that comes up in conversation with them a lot. It's like, okay, you're feeling this thing. Uh, the only decision you can really make is what you're going to do about that. And I think that when it comes to asking big questions about not just technology, but like what it is that we are in a world after this idea of the sort of atomistic, separate, self-authoring individual of industrial modernity. Like, what are we now that we know that we are networked and porous and that we are, you know, uh, intrinsically emergent from multi-scale complex systems, that we're part of the planet, that our technologies are part of the planet, and so on. Like there's this different kind of selfhood emerges in which the nature of decision making looks different, and like for no reason other than I like talking about it. I'll just add that this when I was running at the time was an enormous Facebook group for complex system science when I was doing SciComm for the Santa Fe Institute. One of the most popular topics in that group was the question of free will. Like, can complex system science help us understand free will? And, the organization itself kind of tried to stray from a direct address of these things. But deep in the field of complexity research is this idea of complementarity. The idea that, if you look at yourself at one level, we're not trying to reduce everything to, like if we study the atom, then we're going to be able to figure out how cells work. It's like that was like the founding realization of 21st century science, is that you have multiple explanatory levels. And so you can't, so you look at us at the human scale and you've got a person that's making decisions. People like Richard Dawkins want to reduce everything to this sort of machinic, reproductive thing that like genes are doing. And that's just wrong. It's like evolution is simultaneously selecting at all of these different scales. And, the randomness is maybe not something that actually, like ontologically exists. It's like, you can't really prove randomness. Like all you can do is examine a finite string of bits and like whether you can find a pattern in it or not. And so the question of free will, and again, when it comes to like, choice and our place in this much more expansive cosmology, is a question of like, well, okay, we have it and we don't. It depends on what level you want to tell the story from. Why, in this particular setting, like why does the assertion of free will or the assertion of determinism matter? And then you get a lot more play out of being able to bring multiple perspectives to bear on a thing like that. So, really, it's like Humans on the Loop is in part just a way of reminding the extremely agentic individuals who appear to be driving our world right now, that actually, like I get into these conversations a lot about like, are billionaires really making decisions, or are they just like totally subservient to the market forces? Is Elon Musk basically just like a puppet for capital? And it's like, we all think like, oh, you could choose to do better, but it's like, the further you climb a status and power hierarchy, the more your decisions are constrained by that. And then on the other hand, people who feel like they have no power whatsoever, no agency whatsoever, it's like, well, you're never completely out of a loop. You're not, there's always something that you can affect because all of us are open systems, so that's a rant for you.
Love it. Love it. And it segues perfectly into the more narrow focus of today's convo, though, of course, I want to pull back later if we have time on the discussion of randomness, because I have more follow-ups, and free will for that matter. But in service of being dedicated to the sort of entree that people join this talk for, I want to talk about rewilding reality. And this is something we've both been kind of hovering around, trying to sense make what the advent of AI generated content writ large, particularly synthetic media, might mean for this construction of reality thing that we're doing. So let's rewind to, I believe it was 2016 or 2017 when you first started writing about this.
17.
Yeah, 2017. So let's start there. Let's start with like, what were your ground truths at the time? What were your kind of like opening experiences and senses of this thing that was emerging before we had manifestations of it in the world?
Well, I mean, there have been manifestations of it in the world for a long time. I mean, people were already very troubled by the spread of disinformation, like well before COVID. Like I like tracing this back in a, in a kind of a cultural archaeology sense. There was when they were making Jurassic Park, and like originally they were going to have Phil Tippett do the stop motion dinosaurs. And then Dennis Muren and Michael Lantieri were working in the the ILM skunkworks and had come up with this short demo of the computer generated Tyrannosaurus. And there's a documentary on Disney Plus about the history of ILM, where they talked to Spielberg and Kathleen Kennedy and other people that were in the screening room when that first test footage was shown to them, and they talk about it as a kind of religious experience, because that was the moment that they realized that they were no longer limited to what they could do with their models and their in-camera effects and this kind of stuff. And that was that was the sort of apotheosis. Like that there was an ingress then. I think like that's where I would start a story for the sake of narrative about what it is that we're living through now, which is, now it's much easier to see how the development of information technology is, in some sense, a development of our ability to externalize thought. And, with that comes all kinds of problems. So in 2017, I had just heard the first demo by Adobe of their early proprietary voice cloning software, which I think at the time required like 2 minutes of audio. And then like within months, other people were working on it. And by the time Google got around to it, I think it was like 5 seconds of audio that they needed to simulate you. And I wasn't even thinking about video really at the time. I was just thinking about, the scene in Terminator 2, where, they call home and the T-1000 answers the phone and it's, your mother is dead, your stepmother is dead, and it's like, so that's been in us, for most of my life, is, this idea that, uh, that has roots much more deeply in sort of like, uh, fairy changeling lore and this kind of thing. Like, I think there's like some part of us that has always been afraid of or expecting this kind of a thing, like, when the mirror, became kind of accessible as a technology, and people were afraid that, the person in the mirror could like reach out and strangle you and replace you, or that, that cameras steal your soul. And, so there's like, this is just I see like an ongoing development of this kind of like reckoning with simulation and the duplication. But that was when it really hit me that we're right around the bend from a world where, just to add another pin on the map of what was going on at that time, Disney had just patented a touchscreen interface that used electrical currents to simulate different kinds of textures. And so, like, I don't hear many people talking about this, but like part of that story that I wrote in 2017, in An Oral History of the End of Reality, was about the point where it's like we keep getting more kind of progressively used to advanced simulation, up to the point where obviously there's going to be a kind of like retro romantic, exodus back into analog media. But, between the sort of haptic spoofing, where it's like you don't even know for sure that you're actually touching the thing you think you're touching, to the, another couple of technologies I had been tracking for a few years at that point. One was, like directly beaming images into the eye, so that you can, like, it looks like, through pico projectors, it looks like, your buddy on the video call is actually standing there in the room with you. And then also ultrasound lasers that were developed, I think, like even a decade before that, where the audio signal degrades in the air from a point emitter so that you can target people across the street with ads as they're walking past your store, and only they will hear the ad, which, like, for somebody who was, using guerrilla tactics to unplug uh, renegade sound systems in music festival parking lots, trying to help people get some sleep. The idea of just being able to beam audio into somebody has its perks, but, like, one of those things is that we're definitely, trending toward the sort of Phil Dick world where uh, you can give everybody, like right now you can tell, like, so I'm having a different experience to you because my algorithmic news feed is here, but I'm looking at my phone, and it's like we're approaching that point where um, there's no like external technological indicator that you are experiencing a completely different sensorium than I am. So what does that mean? What kind of desperate gestures are we likely to find ourselves affecting as we try to cling to a modern notion of reality? What another person who was thinking about this a lot at the time was York University philosopher Regina Rini, and she talked about the loss of the epistemic backstop, which was this idea, like, pics or it didn't happen, right? That there was this short moment of about 150 years with photography where photography was admissible evidence in courts of law. It was proof. And before that, we didn't have proof. And so I think that, like, when I look back to, when I look to the question of rewilding reality, and I don't want to get ahead of you here, but just to say that, like, uh, in the sense that, Marshall McLuhan talks about new media engaged in, like, cultural retrieval, like the revival of things that were lost in the previous media environment. One of those things that I think we're going to retrieve moving forward is the dependence on trust and reputation, and, like, it's not going to be enough to see the thing or to hear the thing. Like, you're going to need something else to provide that epistemic backstop.
Mm. Well, I'm also put in mind of there's this book you've probably read, but for folks who haven't, it's called Mediated Construction of Reality. So Coldry and Hepp, where, among other things, they are proposing that the way that media interacts with reality is a process of subsumption, not displacement. Like, even the fact that we're doing this Substack Live is a subsumption of radio, of live TV, of our writing. And so that, like, those media kind of filter and find different places to express. And that there've been these, like, 4 major waves of kind of like almost like, literal paradigm shifts in terms of they have a specific term for it, but I'm totally blanking on it. And that, we're now in this datafication wave. And so thinking about what it means when all these various forms of media that have been these, like, discrete things that had this epistemic backstop to them, all of those backstops fall away. And I know that I'm sort of stretching what's meant by that term, but it's like we're now in this moment where, as you said, all of your senses can be deceived. And with the algorithmic rails of social media and information ecosystems, we're just sort of left to wonder. There's this kind of what if, Stephen Marsh calls it the big blur. Like, is that real? I don't know. Now everything is a forensic exercise. And even if you have, really strong forensic capability, you still have you have generally speaking, more of an uphill battle today than you did 10 years ago. Even though, as you said, forgeries and digital duplicates have been around since the beginning of whatever medium you could create something earnestly in. I mean, famously, I think 1839 was when the first photoshopped image was produced. Well, you said you don't want to get ahead of things, but let's go to it. So in talking through the name of this conversation, we came to Rewilding Reality at your suggestion, and I think it's great. I'm obviously maybe over-indexing on Doom a little bit right now, so I appreciate that you're broadening this conversation to a more open-ended frame. And so I think that's maybe a good place to kind of get into the meat of this, is like, why was rewilding reality the thing that came to you? I know that you're writing a lot about myth and magic and outsider science. Like, there's a lot of sort of heterodox positions that are appealing to you and that you write about with a lot of lucidity. So let's start there.
Well, first of all, I just some sympathy for over-indexing on doom. I mean, I was born in LA, you know. I'm praying for mayhem. I'm praying for tidal waves. You know, like one is not one does not become a paleontologist without some sort of like mass extinction kink. You know, like just like thinking about the, you know, like wow, the meteor. Like I'm glad I wasn't there. Um, but yeah, so but at the same time, that same lifelong contemplation also, I think, gives someone perspective. Like, you know, Doug Irwin, a paleontologist at the Smithsonian, you know, has made himself somewhat unpopular by making a like a quantitative scientific argument that we're not actually living through the sixth mass extinction. You know, that like this is bad, this is really bad, but it's not quite, you know, it's not quite as bad as, you know. So of course that's not even a position that's shared by all paleontologists, but like, okay, so where's the rewilding come in here? Again, like actually I haven't brought it up yet, which is amazing. There's usually time to William Irwin Thompson on my calls is like a minute. But one of my favorite historians was the late William Irwin Thompson, who rage quit MIT in, I think, 1972 and founded this think tank for planetary culture called the Lindisfarne Association that was like a mixing pool of all of the most influential latter 20th century thinkers, you know, Greg Bateson, uh, Paulo Soleri, Stuart Brand, you know, Brian Arthur, Stuart Kaufman, Hazel Henderson, Joan Halifax, etc. And he saw from the very beginning, like, you know, he bailed from MIT because he saw the like the assumptions embedded in technocratic globalism and a sort of like cybernetic managerial approach to planetary systems that had emerged out of the Second World War, and was just like, well, this is not going to end well for that view. Like this is, you know, it may seem like it's sort of, you know, a foregone conclusion that, you know, that we're headed to, you know, this sort of new world order. But what he saw and what other people like Zygmunt Bauman, who wrote Liquid Modernity, have seen is that basically like the more to put it in like as you did in sort of thermodynamic terms, the more you export entropy in order to control the variables within a system, the more brittle that system becomes, the less adaptable, the more subject to surprise on the part of whatever it kicked out. And so we've been at this as civilized humans now for thousands of years, right? Of like the walled city, and then imagining that nature exists beyond the wall and that culture exists within the wall, and that these are two sort of categorically different domains. And that whole thing has been coming apart now for some time. I mean, it's no longer even remotely a tenable position in the sciences that, you know, the idea of human exceptionalism is bunk. You know, it turns out that cities actually uh, provide a number of really useful niches to wild animals. You know, like any way you want to look at this, the idea that, you know, that everything we want as human beings was either hard coded into us by, you know, pre-civilizational evolution, or has been, you know, is something that has been shaped into our desire by state and market forces that are themselves emergent and beyond the control of any one person or group of people. So like I get very sort of eldritch about this. When I love bringing up Cosmo Shalizi, the physicist who says, oh, the singularity happened like 100 years ago. We created these like elder gods. They're called corporations. They run the world. I talked about that with Chris Ryan on Future Fossils also, about this idea that going all the way back to early agrarian societies, that it's the humans have really, it hasn't been the human age, it's been the institutional age. But these are even though that these are sort of artificial beings, they are nonetheless beings that emerged uh, without our total knowledge of them, and certainly without their total knowledge of us, in a way that like James C. Scott talks about, seeing like a state, like in order for things to be regulated at scale, you have to coarse grain information. And so like one of the things I've been playing, I'm getting a little off topic, but one of the things I've been playing with lately is this idea that large language models are actually like a technology for institutions, in the way that the microscope was a technology for people to see that we're made out of cells. Like now, institutions can see the people that they're made out of in a different way. And so you can expect a lot of, major socioeconomic transformation downhill of that, of like simply being able to resolve things at that level of dimensionality. But so like, yeah, so we live in this built wilderness, and one of the things that goes with that is goes with the sort of the erosion of the nature culture divide, or this the self other divide. All these like dualistic formulations of modernity is the like true and false. It's also becomes much more nuanced. you know, like there are we live in a world that has to like face and reconcile and like integrate paradox in course of dealing with this. That there are um, plenty of statements that are true from one position and untrue from another. I wrote what was it? What is being more than a machine? And I talked a lot about the species concept in that piece, and how like there is no thing that is a species. There are ideas that are species, that of what is a species, that are useful to scientists in different settings, for the communication of their idea, for the research of something. And similarly, like, what does it mean to be a human? What does it mean to be a machine? All of these things are political battlegrounds right now, but they like the only way that we, I think, are going to get anywhere in these ideological conflicts is by stepping back the way that Bill Thompson did, and see how these different positions are part of larger biospheric processes of collective intelligence. That like regardless of what is actually true in a particular debate, the fact that you get these sort of persistent opposed positions looks to somebody like Thompson and to somebody like myself that as like, well, it's, lifting your arm and lowering your arm, neither of those is true, right? Like, but you have an opposed pair of like biceps and triceps that are responsible for the, this computation that's going on of like how to move yourself in a physical environment. And that's actually what's going on in a much larger, much higher dimensional space in society and in the economy and so on. And so I'll stop there.
Well, you sparked a few things for me. One, my favorite example, I mean, you reference it in terms of species, like species don't exist. My favorite example of this is vegetables aren't real. Vegetables are a totally invented category to contain tubers and leaves and roots, but there's no one thing that a vegetable is. And that scaffolds all across, our like certain berries aren't berries, certain nuts aren't nuts. Like we're applying these categories, these labels, and then that's a means of instrumentalizing reality to drive effect. Yeah, effect with an E. Of course, that then gets in the way of the sort of affective dimensions of reality, and of course, the ongoing question that I and many others have, and I suspect you have too, which is like, have we reached the limits of what materialism can tell us, and maybe is it time to start looking to other epistemes to understand, you know, cosmological, foundations. Um, with the question of like not to bring us back to the spine a little bit, and then we can kind of like
Yeah.
tendril off again. I think a lot of people, certainly a lot of people on this live, but a lot of people in my life are sort of coming to me about this too, and I'm sure they are with you. Is we're now in this moment where whatever we'll say about singularities and AGI and whatever else, there's a certain type of epistemic singularity that has occurred with the advent of Sora 2, with the progression of large language models. We're now in this point where there are a lot of large-scale informational problems. How are you thinking about how we get and those are reflective of older constructions of reality? This, as you said, this like post-industrial modern understanding of reality. How do we get out? How do we get to the promised land?
Yes, thank you for bringing it back to the spine. I mean, well, like, I want to start by saying first that I don't want to suggest something that I think is actually going to become very commonplace. I'm already seeing it now, which is that, nothing is real, right? This sort of like nihilistic, like, oh, everything is just the labels we apply to whatever. And, that to me seems to be kind of an equal and opposite symptom of, like, I don't know if anyone here has seen Rodney Asher's A Glitch in the Matrix, which fabulous documentary about, what happens when you get into this, this sort of solipsistic, nihilistic kind of simulation delusion. But what does happen is that uh, the map does not, like this idea that the map is not the territory is only partially true. Like the map also becomes the territory in the sense that, the like in complexity economics, the more people that are acting under a particular belief system, the more you have to model, like they are forming the behavior that you are modeling in your world model and are using to constrain and guide your behavior. And so like there are two levels here. There's like the level of like what is the so-called ground truth, and then there's the question of like how much of that ground truth is the behavior based on something that may or may not be true in that sort of naive sense, but is nonetheless something that we have to reckon with. I really like the way that you put it in your recent piece on deepfakes about how like the bigger issue is not so much actually how exactly did you say this? I've got the tab open. Hold on. You said
Quoting me to my face.
yeah. Um, oh no, that was in. Let's see. Yes, bad actors will weaponize the existence of generative video models to dismiss human recorded footage. For example, that Sora is emerging while Republicans continue to use every tool in their toolkit to block the release of the Epstein files is literally problematic. So, like, it's not just that you might see something, you might, it's not that just that your parents are going to see, like, look at this dog I made out of spaghetti. And you have to be like, Mom, that's Mid-Journey. It's that, the other much more horrifying thing that I'm seeing is that people no longer believe that the people that they're interacting with online are human. And the second order consequence of that is that there's going to be this enormous, desperate push for some sort of like identity management system. And depending on how that kind of a system is implemented, it's very likely that it will not work as advertised. It will be every bit as manipulable as the systems we have now, and it will aggravate the problems that we're facing already. So the question of, and then there's also the issue of like, if you are not willing to believe in something, then you are not willing to act. So, nihilism is actually highly acidic to coordination, to political cooperation. Sure, whatever, you're just a robot kind of stuff, which is going to get I think actually will get much, much worse before it gets better. But we are already seeing other approaches grow up through that decay. And like one of the things that I had my eye on a few years ago, and I need to sort of issue a caveat here that I don't believe that the actual technical implementation of this approach will work, but I liked where Pooja Olhaver's head was at when she wrote The Decentralized Society with Glenn Weil and Vitalik Buterin about using Ethereum for pseudonymous decentralized reputation systems, and then being able to use those systems to decompose like voting and scientific replication and actually get a sense for the distance on a social graph, and also therefore on like a perspectival graph between people that are converging on a particular position. So like one of the problems that we have right now is the majority votes can be done, like by sort of collusion. And you can have, like, okay, 51% of people agreed on this, but they all watched the same television station. They all went to the same university. And the other, if we were to be truly scientific about this, like the other 49%, the minority position, actually represents an enormous span of perspectives scattered across like the latent space, like, across the high dimensional map of all of the positions that can be taken. And so like that's how science is actually done. And yet, or at least it is sort of ideally, that's how science is done, but that's not how science is actually practiced now. We have a similar problem with, you brought up, alternative epistemologies. And so like one of the things that, you see with, the way that academia has responded to, like Jeff Kripal wrote this fabulous book, The Flip, where he interviewed all of these physicists who had experiences that made them doubt a materialist cosmology. They can't talk about it because they'll put their careers in jeopardy. You have people like Dean Radin and Russell Targ doing work on psi phenomena, but like there are these strong dampening effects on that kind of thing that happens. Is basically kind of like a herd think around the intense pressure that I sympathize with a lot. I have a lot of academic friends, and I really feel for them in the way that reputation maintenance makes it impossible for them to entertain even sort of like not like crazy ideas, but what to them seem crazy because they would be putting too much on the line. So you just as an aside, like always talk to the like retired scientists, like the ones or the really, really young ones, the ones that haven't been totally hammered down yet, the ones that have nothing to lose. You get much more, fertile and exploratory conversations that way. So, like Pooja Olhaver's system for non-transferable token-based identity on the blockchain has a problem because it's still a universal consensus algorithm. So it's trying to patch a kind of bottom up epistemic construction of knowledge onto something that depends on, this unified uh, hash record. And that probably won't work. That's sort of like creating a church of science and expecting it to, um, but there are other systems out there, that are based on like directed acyclic graphs, like holochain, where security is handled uh, in basically at the edges of the network rather than, relying on this like computationally intensive consensus layer. And so that graph builds itself up from the bottom up. And in the same way that if you like take a step back and you look at the structure of scientific knowledge, scientific fact construction is based on, third person verification. Well, second person verification is intersubjective agreement. It's like you and I are close enough to one another that we probably agree on most things. So, like, if we really want to know that this thing is, if we really want to test something rather than just agree, just agreeing has a really, really important function in terms of like reducing the friction and increasing the efficiency, for social cohesion and so on. But it's not great as a truth mechanism. So if you want to test it, you got to go find somebody who radically disagrees with you, but not so much that you can't have the conversation. Now, science has always seen this as like a 3-point problem existing within an empirical methodology. But I went and I studied integral theory and like multi-methodological research in grad school. And like one of the things that they talked about was nth person verification, where you're looking for convergence in findings across like multiple different methodologies, like empiricism and hermeneutics, for instance. Um, and also like they have incommensurable data ontology, right? Like, like meaning and quantitative data, we don't really know how to get them to fuse, but we're starting to see over the last 40 years or so that there are fields like neurotheology where, you go ahead, put monks in a scanner and you can see that there is uh, a third person description of what is going on in someone's brain that consistently correlates with first person results of what they are actually experiencing. And then you can kind of track how that changes or, what is conserved across different traditions like Buddhist meditation or Christian prayer and so on. So there are ways to do this. And now we also have ways that I think the more important thing on some level is that we right now uh, we have a credentialization problem, right? Like some schools have become degree mills. Non-experts have a hard time validating the expertise of people or like experts in one field, let's say, because it's not like a one-dimensional thing. If I'm an expert biologist and you're an expert climate scientist, like all that I can really do is just trust that the the credentials issuing system worked and that your peers are actually holding you accountable, but there's no way to really see that. And so like one of the this gets into you know uh, the issue of coordination at scale. I did a conversation with uh, Utah philosopher CT Nguyen about this a few years. I'll share for your show notes about the expert identification problem and like how we approach it with these kinds of decentralized reputation tools that build reputation from the bottom up. Um, and then you can kind of see that, like, look, I don't understand what makes this person an expert, but it's a much more high dimensional portrait of the fact that there are people that are issuing sort of peer review, that are validating you. So in that sense, it is kind of a cypherpunk thing where it's like these statements are validated by a network of people that are engaged in like local surveillance activity around you, and then can be verified at ever distant points along a graph of like increasingly alien positions, people with completely different Bayesian priors. And so like I actually think that like this crisis to reality that we're going through now is going to beget something that actually looks a lot more like what science has always claimed it was, which is, something that is unwilling to make absolute final claims about reality, is always provisional, is always checking itself against, is always testing reproducibility, and is creating a legible record of the, like, basically how many hits those claims have taken and stayed standing, so that it's not just like, this is true or false. It's like, well, this has been true for 300 years among, 350 million people. And these are the areas in which, we can still, possibly take a battering ram to the castle of fact. And so it's going to encourage us to test things much more deliberately and rigorously, and with much greater information on how to do so.
Well, just to use a very, very small personal example to that effect, my like going metric for if I should use ChatGPT or any LLM is essentially if it will further complicate and propel existing questions or ideas I have. Anything that's just serving me back a quick answer is I shouldn't use AI for. And so one thing that I actually derive a lot of joy out of, and again, to your point, I don't treat this as a period, I treat this as a colon, is gap analysis. Is basically like taking one paper or multiple different books or like things that I've already read or intend to read connected with things I have read and ask for the gap analysis. And sure, it's not getting every single gap, but it's identifying gaps that I wouldn't know to look for that I can then go pursue on my own. And again, I'm not saying like what you're describing is this kind of like macro multidimensional sort of matrix that sort of maybe automates some of that. But just from my personal experience, there's a lot of efficacy to like knowledge production in that way of thinking. Would you say like, all requisite caveats, and we've already talked about some of the like doom zones and you referenced my piece. If people have read my piece, I'm obviously extremely concerned with the latest OpenAI developments and just broadly how the AI industry is being just sort of rocketed down, to mix metaphors here, rocketed down, techno-feudalist rails. It's really a toxic cocktail at the moment. But to think broadly, which you're quite good at, building on what you were just talking about, what would be like if you had to steelman a pro-social use case for AI as we understand it today, but also as we might understand it kind of speculating out to achieve some of what you just described? Like, what would that look like at implementation level in a way that brought about a better world?
I mean, what I'm going to offer is just a sort of interference pattern that I see emerging from people that are working on, something, at this point, like dozens or hundreds of individual and like team-based development efforts in my own personal network. So like, as far as I'm concerned, like I'm hopeful because I imagine that there are millions of people trying to crack this nut around the world and are building toward a similar thing. Um, like the first thing I'll say is that like, I think I gave this talk on high dimensional foraging at the Diverse Intelligences Summer Institute this year. And this within days, like just a couple days before I was writing this talk, and I found a piece by Robin Hanson, who was also talking about high dimensional foraging, the economist. And, it was basically saying, we're only seeing this, this very, very low dimensional projection of what actually matters. So I think that like in terms of technical implementation, one of the things that has to change and is going to change is that we're not going to be interacting with data in this like dimensionally impoverished way anymore. Our brains were designed, we evolved to navigate richly structured physical environments that change over time. And, our hippocampal grid cells, like our memory systems are built on top of the earlier systems that allow us to orient ourselves in space. So, like, one of the things that I think is going to change that it is that we're going to get new interfaces that are going to bring together multiple different data feeds, like algorithmic feeds, and reconcile those feeds with like sovereign personal context engines for us. And when I say us, what I mean is like whomever is navigating these landscapes, it'll be individual human users. It'll be like the digital twin of a city and like city management, like that is, like at every level at which, information is aggregated and collective intelligence emerges, there will be some sort of twin that will be based on a, like at least optionally offline, locally generated, high context personal model of you, which is different from what my buddy Alex Komorowski calls the dossiers on us. It's like everybody sees a little piece of the elephant. And so what you want is a kind of stereoscopic view of like like a relevance landscape where every linear news feed maybe is like a direction that you could be looking off into the distance, and that an entire landscape is made out of because like if you log into Facebook now, or whatever, Instagram, Substack, you get whatever they thought was most relevant to you at the top. And if there's something 100 posts down that you find far more interesting, you may never ever get to it. But like if that were laid out before you on a landscape, I one of the things I brought up in that talk was the way that Nintendo managed attention for the Legend of Zelda games on Switch. There was a brilliant short video about how they're like, okay, this is an open world game. We want to encourage agency. We want to encourage exploration, but there are still like beats in the story that we want people to hit. And so, how do you make something alluring at a distance? And like that kind of game design knowledge, I think, gets brought into these systems where it's like your personal context engine might look 1,000 rows down somebody's search results for you and see something that it knows is very salient to you that might be, a mountain off in the distance. And like whatever they placed at your feet is less important. But the idea is that we have a way of aggregating all of these things and then applying personal policy to the way that they are presented to us, to the schema that we use to represent them and navigate them and index them spatiotemporally. So like that's one piece, is just that like sort of like, procedural generative environments and game design logic are brought into user interfaces in a way that actually sort of realizes some of the original, aspirations of virtual reality, instead of like collapsing everything down to what we have now, which is like the squirt, where it's like, you only see the first, the next token when it's like, it's even worse on ChatGPT than it is on Facebook, because you don't see the spread of possible answers, and it like you have to regenerate to see like what else it could have said. And there are no fucking links. Like there's no way. Like that's another thing is like we have to be able to navigate this stuff. Like I am a diehard advocate of retrieval augmented models because I want everything to be able to lead you deeper, closer to source material and to evaluate that stuff yourself. Um, Another thing is that all of this, I think, is basically just an affordance for better collective intelligence, uh, or like distributed computation in terms of like giving us the information that we need about our shared data environments to know when we are converging and diverging in high dimensional space. Like right now, economists. I'm part of the AI Capabilities and Alignment Consensus Project, and they've got a special issue of the Proceedings of the Royal Society, Phil Trans A, that's coming out early next year. Michael Levin and Ben Lyons wrote a piece on this about price signaling as the cognitive glue of the economy as a collective intelligence. And it's like, well, that's all well and good, but price signal is a one-dimensional signal. And, like what we have is a much, we have this problem where like, there's not enough information in the job description or the CV for employers to actually find the people that are best fit for the open roles in their teams, or for the people who are looking for work. Like if you still like futz with LinkedIn, like forget it. The suggestions it gives you are useless. Like it's in such an intense aggravation of the problem of feeling like you can't bring your full self to work. But like, and obviously we don't all want to just have our twins speed date the twins of every possible hiring agency and then give you this is your new job. There's no agency in that, but there's a middle ground. The sort of like on the loop answer there is that that things that are sort of near you, that are appropriate to you, are near you in space. Or like if your research trajectory is converging on the research of someone else in your field, like you may not have time as a scientist to actually read all of the state-of-the-art work that's coming out of your discipline, but you should be able to see it in a kind of at a glance way as a landscape of people who are moving around and whose this is like built out of AI augmented interdisciplinary collaboration research by people like James Evans at the University of Chicago was the one who really first turned me on to this possibility of like the gap analysis being, the machine is helping us do at scale what naive experts in another field who come in and ask like stupid questions in some other discipline are basically doing. And like that's how you get scientific revolutions. Now, I think that ability to prospect and see the gaps. And so it's not just about like finding the people who are most like you that you can collaborate with. It's also about knowing where there is already too much attention, because like the slowed canonical innovation that we're seeing in science and engineering and everywhere where there are like mass market forces at work has to do again with that sort of dimensional collapse. And so like if we can open that back up, then we get at least the opportunity to go dig somewhere no one else is digging. Like we can see that no one else is looking here. We don't have to like we don't have to take the risk of spending years developing something that it turns out 10 other people were also developing in their secret thing at the same time. Like it actually becomes much more this kind of interface becomes a very effective tool for us to engage in like a high temperature search of the adjacent possible. And I think that this kind of thing is going to be, I think the inevitability of this, various approaches to this kind of a thing are based on the fact that we are already in crisis, and people are already talking about how we need to stimulate more original thought. And the last thing I'll say about that is that in the sense that productivity is for robots, and if it can be automated, it will be automated. And so what that means for us is that we're going through a kind of a transition into uh, much, much more continual learning, and rather than self-actualization in a consumer lifestyle economy, again, that modern idea of this is the authentic me, it becomes staying ahead of the legible, staying ahead of what can be automated, because that can then be reproduced at near, diminishing marginal cost. And if you stay put, then you're choosing comfort in the short term at the risk of opportunity and stability and security in the long term. So I mean, what I haven't talked about yet as far as technical implementation is the uh in order for this economy to make the flip that I think it's making, between where oh, you're an artist, why don't you become a factory worker, to I'm going to be telling my kids, don't you dare become a factory worker. You have to become an artist, because the real money is in uh, generating ideas that are unique, that are not just feeding the known back into itself. And I really do think the economic incentives are going to flip over the next few decades. They're already, you can already see it, you know. But another piece that's necessary there is this. I don't want to say privacy first, but it is a sovereign data environment. Um, like a lot, some of the teams I'm closest with right now are trying to address this question of how the vast majority of the value of the internet economy is in data that people are generating and not getting paid for. And it's just one of many different instances of an enclosed commons where maybe it doesn't look like privacy in the end. I've been talking about this with Turquoise Sound. Maybe it doesn't look like a return to privacy, but it looks like people are contributing through their public data production to a public trust, a data commons that is paying people for their contributions. So something, I think something is going to shift in terms of the ensuring fractional retroactive reimbursement for whatever it is you happen to be doing. And I think that, just the last thing I'll say here is that I think that I'm an artist that was arguably unemployed by algorithms years before large language models, because of Instagram and the commodification of the image. And so I look at all of the no AI art stuff kind of askance. It doesn't make sense to me why copyright, why style begins with our generation. We are open systems. We've inherited, this extraordinary global heritage of culture. And the idea that we're going to fight over the last little evaporating island of, private personhood, the ownership of style, feels to me well, if you're going to do that, you might as well give the land back to the indigenous, but nobody's arguing for that. Um, so it's like, I think we need just like a completely different implementation of what it means to be a self, going back to like what we were talking about, like there is and is not free will. Like there needs to be a completely different implementation of what it means to be both an individual human and, someone that is inextricable from culture and from ecology and so on. And so like the financial part of this, of the sense of like, uh, every one of us is basically exists because we are we're borrowing from all of these systems that we depend on materially, energetically, informationally. And whatever we give back to that, um, we need better ways of accounting for this. And it can't be just one unified system. It's going to be, a whole myriad of different approaches that are going to be built, I think, on these sort of more local and decentralized, not just reputation, but uh, like knowledge construction architectures. I don't know if
Yeah,
that
I mean,
answered your question.
amply. If you believe that biodiversity is part of what makes the biosphere great, then technodiversity should make your experience with machines great. And we have the opposite of that. We have such monocropping with our tech systems. One thing also to say, I know what you meant, but I actually think the way in which I'll sort of shift it 45 degrees also kind of plays to what you're saying is like people are arguing for giving the land back to the indigenous. Like the land back movement is gaining momentum. The problem is that power structures don't do that. And so it so rarely succeeds, but there are people calling for it. And I think it gets to this point that you're making with the anti AI art thing, which is like it comes back to that thing. I think this comes from the Upstream podcast, but the you don't hate Mondays, you hate capitalism. And I
I
think
was just
that
talking about that this morning. Yeah.
it's such a perfect quote, and it applies so aptly here because it's the economic structures that have induced desperation in the artistic and creative classes that is like in a vacuum, if you have all your basic needs met and everything else is a cherry on top, then if there are people copying your style or whatever, you might be annoyed about that, but it's not an existential threat to you. But because we live in a context in which for so many people this is their livelihood, so that when a corporation opts to hire, a manager on Midjourney or just telling somebody to, create something in the style of XYZ artist, it is a form of economic violence. And so it makes sense, like the I understand completely the motivation. And I even think that even though, like you, I think it's kind of missing the mark a little bit, I'm glad that it exists. Um, but it comes back to another quote I reference all the time is, of all people, James Carville's, "It's the economy, stupid." Where it's just like all of this is just because we live in capitalist endgame. Like we live in the moment when like most of the free and easy resources that could get squeezed out of the earth and out of people have been squeezed out. So now they're, fracking us. And that fracking looks really ugly the way fracking looks ugly. So I guess like all of that in mind, do you see like you talked about there being some kind of you talked about you said you see the evidence for the economic incentives flipping. So cheer me up. where
Well,
where are you seeing that evidence?
okay. So, there is, Chris Anderson's long tail economics, right? Where Kevin Kelly saying, that all you need to get by in a Web 2.0 creator economy is 1,000 true fans. That's a distinct shift from the idea of like mass industrial manufacture, but it's also just a waypoint along a, a trajectory that I infer toward us being able to communicate rich context through digital media such that you have a much easier time finding your sort of one true client. Like it's interesting because I've been watching my buddy Tom Morgan interview uh, a, a legendary coach, Brian Wetton, and he talks about how in like coaching, it's one client, one problem. It's this hyper specialized, tailored thing, and I think that sort of approach rhymes with the like the way that you see a shift in education from preparing people for factories to preparing students for lifelong learning and entrepreneurial activity. Of course, that's not the only shift we're seeing in the educational setting now. There's also, uh, direct hands-on apprenticeship is coming back, but like that's another instance of like whether it's in a sort of like global economic arena or it's in like your own local community, there's a trend back toward high context and very like specific settings, and like not trying to appeal to even necessarily 1,000 people. So like I think that like as we get better at uh, registering and responding to these things, like one of the things that that I think like we always, I say we and always, but what I mean is like in complex systems, there is this very common pattern where you get this rapid scaling, and then like a lot of resources get drawn up by like the primary ecological succession in an ecosystem, and then that creates the soil for secondary succession. And so it's like, I remember years ago, it was like 2010, reading Charles Eisenstein's Ascent of Humanity, and he talked about how late capitalism, like everyone is worrying because it's like basically just weeds growing in an empty lot. And they're like, oh no, like we're going to overgrow the lot. And then what? And he's like, well, then what happens is you get trees. Like then you get this whole other structure that emerges. And I think that when I see these like enormous, like stupidly wasteful, mean trending frontier language models, to me, what they are is basically just like, um, the like we had central publishing before we had desktop publishing. We had like the like it. There's a sort of upfront expenditure in any new system, and then like people have, and I'm not saying that like simply distributing these tools, to go back to the end of reality kind of problem, simply enhancing democratic accessibility to advanced AI is going to solve the problem. Like in a way, uh, it could just sort of lock us into a particular set of assumptions. But optimistically, like what we get is now there's soil for all of these different, for modular AI systems, for edge computing, for compute gradients, for the application of these ideas and to much smaller, more uh, ecologically suitable and culturally suitable approaches at the edges of this network. And I think that it's bound to happen. But like in direct answer to your question, like the the overall trend that I see is that uh, it is because we have relied on the economies of scale that things are breaking. That and so like there's this, we've been seeing it for years. The ex-urbanite movement of like people being like, actually, I don't want to live through COVID again in Manhattan. I want to live, closer to the land. I want more agency, and like this kind of opt out of competition is made possible by the miniaturization, in part anyway, by the miniaturization of modern industry, which is something that Bill Thompson also talked about a lot in his work, about how planetary culture would be, a like highly technologically empowered patchwork of villages rather than like a global village in that sense. And so what those, uh, what that's going to mean is that there's like two layers. Like one is the layer of like cumulative human culture where every new thing contributes. And so therefore, if you want to contribute something meaningful and original, you have better tools now than you did to be sure of your originality. And then on the other end of it, it's that, there's just so much more, so much more push to dig down the other way. So like, I think that, again, like a lot of the most interesting people I know are generalists who really struggle, I mean, yourself included, to like define like what it is exactly your job description is. And I think that's because we are already starting to see the economic pressure for people to just use information technology to find, to explore a possibility graph and find something that other people aren't doing with reasonable confidence, and that's where the real opportunity is, and that's a process that has to keep going because we're in this sort of recombinant explosion. And so what we end up with is an economy that even more strongly favors a sort of fluid, provisional, metamorphic selfhood, in the same way that, like, we were talking earlier about how we get much more rigorous about the construction of fact. Like, there's a sort of weave of consensus, or like partial consensus between perspectives, that gives us something that we can, a raft that we can use when it comes to fact. And something else like that, where it's like the a career becomes an act of improvisation and bricolage, and that if you try to just toe the line and do the thing that is like the most legible thing, well, you're setting yourself up for disruption. So I mean that's kind of how I see the big forces at play here.
Yeah, I mean, to piggyback off of that, and I say this, I'm saying this in a way that sounds light, but of course there's a lot of like harm in this. But we're now in the moment, like rewind 10 years, and that push to compartmentalize, to like have your niche. Given the current landscape, the then current landscape, that made a lot of sense. Like SEO was a thing. People were able to like make livings by cornering particular search terms and like by developing subject matter expertise that aligned with those search terms. So there was like a clear argument for why I should do it. Like you, I've never thought that was like a healthy way, or a productive, not in the economic sense, but like you've got this one precious life, like channeling yourself into stupid hashtags doesn't feel like the best way to use it. But you could see the economic argument for it. We're now in a point where it's kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't, which means that a lot of people, us included, but also the people who kind of made that particular bet, are kind of looking off the edge of a cliff face, where they're like, okay, I did that, and now any old person with a few prompts on ChatGPT can basically create the same course that I'm hawking to my followers. And if they market it better, or they're younger or sexier on social media, then they're going to displace me. And then they're going to go through the same displacement cycle. So I can do that. Or I can try to go this generalist route where there's no clear way to categorize myself, and then therefore no way to like market myself in the sort of capitalist economy. And it comes back to something so elemental, not to keep banging my capitalist drum, and I'm going to take us away from here in a second, but I had Alyssa Battistoni on the podcast, and she has written this incredible new book called Free Gifts, which is talking about how capitalism treats nature as a quote free gift, which she goes to great length to describe, and of course recognizes how it's sort of redundant. And she's drawing from Marx here with that particular phrase. But it's such a crystallizing way of thinking about it, where it's like ecosystem services alone, which are an instrumentalized way to look at the world around you, are worth vastly more than the entire world economy, and yet we don't price them into any of our economic activity. Like the production of oxygen, the AMOC, which is any day now going to flip, like all of those things which make our lives possible, they have zero economic value. So that's a kind of like grand scale echo of what I think happens at micro. And like what I like about the vision you're proposing, what gives me um I'm not going to say hope, but a glimmer of optimism, is the idea that like in the breaking, there'll be more space and more appetite for figuring out what these devalued or non-valued zones are. Because in effect, like with the free gifts of nature, which are the most fundamental important aspects to our existence, I would argue that this kind of hybrid curiosity-led way of living, like it comes back to your question of like, what's the meaning of life and what's your purpose here? Like, is your purpose to like channel yourself into hashtags so that you can sell a course? Or perhaps is it to, more fully step into being the universe experiencing itself and to try to like understand that in more detail? I would argue that that's a vastly more valuable thing. That's my hypothesis. And if there's a context where enough shakeup happens, where more people are equipped to do that, that feels like an amazing thing. What is incumbent upon us, though, for that to happen is to break these really, really entrenched capitalist mechanisms that are boxing us in and boxing us in and boxing us in and extracting every drop out of us.
Oh yeah. Well, I'll one of the things that we haven't squarely identified in this conversation is that a lot of my thinking about the future of the labor economy, the post-job stuff, and I'll send you pieces
Yeah.
on this. Bill Thompson has a really good piece archived at Wild River Review on the digital economy of Brian Arthur, where he's talking about, like a 14th century monk didn't have a job, like they had a vocation, it's like these ideas we've become so, again, entrenched in them that we don't see that like the end of jobs as we are thinking about them might actually be good for the human beings and the biosphere and so on. But like one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is junk DNA. Supposedly 99% of your genome does not code for proteins and therefore does nothing. But of course, since you and I were kids, the scientific state of things has changed. And now we know, although it's still largely mysterious, but now we know that much of that is actually involved in the epigenetic regulation of what genes are being expressed at any given time. And much of that is basically, probably everything else that's considered junk is just little snippets of DNA that have flown below the radar of evolutionary selection, and constitute a kind of noise floor for like parts at hand that are like a reservoir of adaptive potential in the genome, so that it doesn't have to come up with solutions de novo when it's confronted with a novel situation. We see this in bacterial populations that look like they are mutating kind of with foresight, where it's like the within the population, within a bacterial culture, there are so many like mutant variants that they can exchange little bits of their own genome rapidly enough so that when they get hit by a new toxin, it looks like they were anticipating that event. And that's basically the relationship, as I understand it, between culture and the economy. The economy is what is coded into proteins. It's like the productivity, right? Culture is all of that other stuff involved in the illegible regulation of that, the stuff we don't actually see coming off the factory line, and in the production of the like baseline creative response to novel challenges that the economy itself can't adapt to. It's like it can't think about the, because it defines them as externalities, right? Like, this whole
Yeah.
thing is like, it's like it, like if you are profiting, that means that, energy is conserved, like it's coming from somewhere, but it's not on your books, so like how do you deal with the fact that we do need some sort of dimension reduction in order for uh, the coordination at scale, with the fact that there's always this sort of like butterfly in the chaos dynamical equation that's like throwing a spanner in the works of your supply chains and your legislation and so on. And so, like, again, to go all the way back to the beginning of this conversation, when I was talking about the advent of complex cells as a response to a scaling based information crisis, I think about the like modernity is in some sense like a bacterium that has relied on very simple rules to get bigger and bigger and bigger, up to the point where we are now, where there's just way too much noise for it to cohere. And that a lot of what I'm talking about on this call has been the idea of like chromosomal binding, histone groups, epigenetic regulation, viral introns, like that. Really, like the future. When I talk about, to your last question about like why I think divergent thinking is going to be the winner in the like meta industrial planetary economy, it's because 99% of your cell is the divergent, is the junk. It's not actually producing anything. And again, so it's like, the sort of productivity is for robots piece. It's like, well, everywhere I look in the history of life, this kind of answer happens where now we have the tools, like I was saying earlier, like the context. We have tools to prevent context collapse, where we need to be able to put the parts back together. We need, like, there's a way to think of epigenetic regulation as what Stephen Johnson called the revenge of the humanities, of like, we actually need people interpreting the outputs of these systems and the data that we're feeding them, and how what's missing from the all of this. Like the human sense making is becoming so much more apparent as an economic need than it was 10 years ago, and it's obviously still like I wish people were doing more of it, but like, and then the arts is that the other stuff. It's like everything that uh keeps the the AI that is our corporations and our regulatory, state apparatus and so on. Like that stuff's already working the way that AI works. It's uh, coarse graining, aggregation, and then downward, emergent downward causation on human behavior. It's the same shit. The art becomes the noise injection that prevents those models from overfitting and collapse. So like I think that those models increasingly, like we're seeing this, like people are trying to produce synthetic data to try and like, keep the model collapse from happening. And it's like I don't think that you can. This is the one place where it's like I could be wrong here with this. I'm like I'm aware that I could be wrong, but it's like I don't think that we will be able to produce synthetic data that is fast and quality enough to actually do this work. And that what we're starting to see is that this is the thing that people have to do in order to continue reaping the rewards of, planet scale information technologies.
Well, it gets back to something you said at the top of the conversation around randomness. Like we can't plausibly say for certain that there is even such a thing as randomness. And so if we're trying to create synthetic data based on randomizers, then we're probably wrong. Like we're probably creating junk data one way, and not junk data in the way you talk about junk DNA. Maybe perfectly helpful data for understanding randomized systems of information for whatever that's worth. But there might be something expressing in human data that is playing out, in a Fibonacci sequence style that we can't, pattern that we can't see. That when we try to replicate it with synthetic data, it just falls apart. I have to say, I got a notification on my phone that I have 10% battery left, and I want to make sure that the conversation doesn't just like end in the middle of nowhere. So, on that note, we've talked about a ton. There's obviously so much more still that we could talk. We could probably be here for like 5 hours and not even scratch the surface. Is there any one topic related to this rewilding reality, epistemic collapse, anything that we haven't gotten to that you'd either want to like go into a little bit more depth about, if we have touched on it a little bit, or if we haven't touched on it, just to talk through?
I mean, I guess one thing I haven't really brought up yet is that, I've been in a conversation like this one with Lawrence Lundy Bryan of Lunar Ventures over Substack, like just
Who I
cramming
think is
into it.
with us.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah. So like he and I had an interesting exchange recently. He writes really eloquently about the problem. And like one of the things that he was seeing was, the unbundling of the job. And so one of the things I haven't talked about is directly is in response to that piece about how I think that the context engines, like personal context engines and organizational context engines, if implemented well, like wisely, give us a way of situating ourselves in a different constitution of collective labor and not just like individual labor, but that like all of these changes in the nature of selfhood that I'm talking about affect how we see the organization, like the boundaries of selfhood around an organization and around specific like roles in work. Like ants, contrary to popular belief, this is something I brought up in Lawrence's threads. Like it's not division of labor according to biological determinism. It is a stigmergic distributed computation based on pheromonal signaling. So like whatever kind of thing you are, be it a warrior or, worker ant or whatever, you will end up going where the need is based on the kind of quorum activity of the collective sensing and where you happen to be at that time. And that works extremely well. And I can see how, tools like modes that seemed like they had a lot of promise, 8-10 years ago, like the decentralized autonomous organization. Well, it's like, it turns out there's this enormous upfront investment cost in simply like orienting yourself in a fast moving, natively remote collaboration between pseudonymous strangers that, for most people, like they just simply don't have time for that shit. But like, if you can basically project your own policy into the world through your personal context engine and like have it help you find the kinds of teams and the kinds of missions and the kinds of work that you believe yourself to be well suited for based on an enhanced self-knowledge that you develop in a kind of reflective loop with your own AIs, then I think we're going to start seeing this like profusion of different kinds of decentralized autonomous organizations, some of which are going to look like I talked to Austin Wade Smith of Regen Network, whom I adore, and that was Future Fossils 220, talking about autonomous ecological organizations, where it's like, we actually have ecosystemic personhood with, economic agency and legislative protection, and that a watershed could be like making its own trust, like, generating its own money and hiring stewards into its care. And so it's not just necessarily that these are like tech startups that happen, but that, like, this is a way, like, we finally have the tools now to empower uh, people to get paid for doing whatever it is that seems existentially urgent and, personally valuable and like meaning aligned now, I think, for the first time in our lives. I mean, it's not everywhere yet, but like, I think that by the time my kids are grown, it will be something where, this idea that, the millennials were like suffering, like I had, the notion of meaningless work will feel very strange. Like, I actually think it's going to probably be an opposite problem, where it's like algorithmic attention capture is going to be so refined that you kind of have to constantly check in with yourself to make sure that you're not, um, like, it's not just that you're rewarded with dopamine, it's that you're like economically rewarded for focusing on what it is that you find meaningful, and so at some point, that begets this whole question of, like, who am I, and like, where do my desires come from, and like, I think this next generation is going to be so much more fluent and literate in that stuff, than those of us who remember the pre-internet, pre-web kind of era and came into these understandings as adults. Um, they're going to be a different species. I guess then, like, the last thing I would say is that this has been really fun. I'm glad we did
It
this.
has. I am too. One thing to add on really quickly, I saw this. There was a sort of video going around from Amy Poehler's podcast where she talks about the different generational relationships to money, and so she's like, with boomers it was show me the money. With Gen X it was, is it all about money? With millennials it's, where's the money? And with Gen Z it's, what's money? And I feel like that's kind of getting at the trajectory you're describing, where I think simultaneously, like, there'll be less ambient wealth just because of also the sort of energy and environmental factors that are really starting to rear their heads. But also, if what you're saying holds true, and God, I hope it does, is like, even if you're making, it's sort of like what you see in democratic socialist countries. Like, you make way less money, but public services are great. You have much more flexibility between your job to be on unemployment and find your passions. And so I love that vision. And I especially do love, I spend so much time with my like critical hat on, that it's nice to have this detour to really think about, like, what's this big picture of what AI assisted life and reality could be. We just kind of got to go through the breakdown to get there.
Yeah. Well, like Fernanda Ibarra of Holo, she talks about currencies, right?
mm,
Like that, like, a currency is how you see a current
mm.
of value in the world. And I think that that's really, it's like, the what's money thing. This is a serious question. Like, what the hell is it really anyway? It's not just like, what are you talking about? It's like, really, like, what are we measuring? Why? What aren't we measuring? Why not? Sometimes we shouldn't be measuring it because we want to sort of keep uh, certain kinds of value decoupled from market forces, and I would much rather, I think I'm actually I mean, a lot of people listening can probably relate to, like, not being as wealthy as your parents, but feeling like you're, uh, like more balanced, happier person, So if that's the trend that continues, like I certainly have a much more sort of, I guess like endogenous sense of purpose of like living in a generation at the very beginning of a long arc of people. Can you remember when people were talking about a meaning crisis? It's like, how much more obvious could meaning be than like regenerating the biosphere? You know, like what the hell were they on about? You know,
I love
um,
that. I love that.
yeah.
Cool, man. Well, as I said, my phone's gonna die probably any second, so we'll have to do this again because I have more questions, and I also want to hit you with my recurring questions that I do with every guest. So we'll have to coordinate a round two. But in the meantime,
Let's do it.
thank you for spending some time talking.
Absolutely, dude. You're awesome. I'll send you a whole link dump here.
Perfect. I look forward to it.
Take care, everybody.
See ya.